Ja, hei alle sammen. Til dere som her I dag, veldig, veldig hyggelig til en samling I Eyde-klyngen. Til dere som ute og følger oss digitalt, velkommen til dere også. Vi veldig, veldig fornøyd med å kunne samle så mange til en inspirasjonsdag. Dette en ny tradisjon I Eyde-klyngen. Det blir en tradisjon når man gjør ting for tredje gang. Og dere som husker tilbake til 2017, så hadde vi en tilsvarende samling med masse faglige samlingstemaer I Lyngdal. Og så hadde vi tilsvarende som dette I fjor. Så dette skal vi fortsette med. For det vi I Eyde-klyngen driver med, det jo å dele kunnskap. Og spre kunnskap. Og lære av hverandre. Så dette skal vi gjøre I dag. Vi veldig stolte av programmet vårt, som intensivt, spennende, variert, og det dere kan vite at hvis dere egentlig hadde lyst til å følge med på noe annet, så vil vi legge ut disse temaene etterpå, så da kan man lære noe også etterpå. Så velkommen alle sammen, gled dere. Så skal jeg få lov til å ønske en person opp til bordet her, nemlig vår tidligere styreleder Jorunn Gislefoss. Litt applaus. For Jorunn har nemlig fått en ny rolle I Eyde-klyngen, en ny komité som ble etablert av styret rett før korona slapp løs. Men nå skal komiteen jobbe. Vær så god, Jorunn.
Det kjempegøy å fortsatt ha litt oppdrag I Eyde, selv I ny rolle. Nå jeg jo fakultetsdirektør på teknologi og realfag på UiA, men jeg var jo styreleder I Eyde-klyngen, det ble vel nesten 9 år, tror jeg, I 2 perioder. Så det veldig stas å ha litt oppdrag ennå. Og vi skal rett og slett lansere en ny pris I dag. Og den kaller vi da originalt nok for Eyde-prisen. Så den har vi tenkt skal gå til en gruppe som skal samarbeide om de felles målene som Eyde-klyngen har satt seg. Og de listet opp der. Det det som utgangspunktet for utdelingen av prisen. Så da skal den sikre norsk material- og prosessindustris konkurransekraft I lavutslippssamfunnet. Det en stor overskrift. Bidra til økt investering I prosessindustrien I Norge. Styrke verdikjeden rundt prosessindustrien og bidra til bærekraftvekst I leverandørbedrifter knyttet til prosessindustrien. Og så skal vi også utvikle nye lønnsomme forretningsområder basert på prosessindustriens fortrinn og behov. Så det som står nede I bobla, det har dere lest nå, mens jeg har sagt de andre tingene. Så det kan dere lese. Vi kan bare ta neste slide, skal vi se. Nei, da hopper vi. Sånn, ja. Takk. Så dette kan jo folk nominere til. Og det ønsker vi jo, og håper vi får mange nominasjoner. Det frist 11. februar. Der kommer ut informasjon fra Eyde-klyngen om dette her, så at alle kan søke. Og det går an å nominere seg selv, og det går an å nominere andre. Vi tenker at det skal være I gruppe. Det en ting, så ikke enkeltpersoner her. Og så planen å dele ut prisen på årsmøtet I 2022. Og så ser dere nederst, det var min oppgave, jeg har vel blitt sånn såkalt juryformann I denne her. Det var stor valgkamp om det. Men det består altså juryen av meg og Agnete på Glencore og Trond Kildal. Så vi 3 utgjør juryen sammen. Så da skal vi prøve å finne ut av hvem skal få denne prisen. Men for å bestemme det, så må vi jo ha nominasjoner. Så det håper vi virkelig der kommer med mange kloke og bra bidrag. Det var det. Takk, takk.
Tusen takk, Jorunn. So now we switch language. My name is Christoph Pink. I work in the Eyde cluster as an EU consultant. And I have the honor to introduce our first speaker today, Janusz Potocznik. He'll join us digitally. Janusz worked in the European Commission. He was actually a commissioner for environment and for science and research before that. And nowadays he's the co-chair of the United Nations Resource Panel. And he also is a partner in a company called Systemic. So, Janusz, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I hope you are hearing me well. I will start sharing my screen. This was a quick lecture of Norwegian language, but I doubt that I have remembered a lot. But we are starting with something which I would like to share with you to put a bit everything what you are doing in a perspective. So the first question I would like to address, it's actually the main challenges, the diagnosis of the problem. One thing which is extremely important, and we are not aware enough about it, is that actually we are the first generation which is living in socio-ecological system of planetary scope. You can see it either through climate, through COVID, through digitalization, internet, through trade, traveling, and so on. So we are more interconnected and interdependent than ever, which means that our individual and collective responsibility has thus enormously increased. The Club of Rome has nicely analyzed that, saying that we have moved from the empty world, which was dominated by nature, to the full world, which is now dominated by humans. In the empty world, it was labor and infrastructure, which were the limiting factors of the human well-being, while in the full world, it's natural resources and environmental things, which are the limiting factors of human well-being, which means that if you want to talk about economic success for the future, you can't do that without ignoring natural resources and environmental questions. You have certainly seen that. That's from Kate Raworth, Donut Economy, where basically she's saying that you have two parts, inner circle, which are human needs, which are expanding, and the outer circle, which are the planetary boundaries. And the green space is actually the safe operating space. Humanity is already currently living in out of balance, so we are overshooting planetary boundaries when it comes to climate change, nitrogen, phosphorus loading, land conservation, and biodiversity disappearance, biodiversity loss. Of course, the story is not exactly equal in all the countries. If we go from Malawi, China, Belgium to Australia, or if we put them all together in one slide, you have quite a number of countries where the social thresholds are far from being reached, but they are also not transgressing planetary boundaries. Then you have the countries which are in the quick development, which are already to a large extent approaching or transgressing planetary boundaries, but still not having a proper social thresholds achieved. And then there are countries like yours and practically all in the European Union, where we can see that we are very much transgressing planetary boundaries, but of course that also quality of life which we are enjoying, it's relatively high. In the recent Dasgupta review, which talk about biodiversity of economics of biodiversity, they have identified two main reasons why we are in situation as we are. The first one was identified as institutional failure, and the second one as the failure of contemporary economics to acknowledge that we, that means humans, are actually embedded in and not external to nature, and to, of course, act accordingly, which I can nicely probably summarize in this slide. So, as you know, we work on market economies, and one of the core assumptions of the economic theory is that us, producers and consumers, behave rationally, which is actually true. So the signals which we are receiving on the market are those on the basis of which we are deciding. Unfortunately, the signals which we are getting from the market are a bit simplified. Production capital, it's overvalued, over-rewarded. Human capital, undervalued, under-rewarded. And natural capital, in many cases, not valued at all. So if we think that we will reach with that economic, social, and environmental balance, we are, of course, mistaken. And what we can see from this rational behavior is that it is rational only in the short run. So we are behaving rationally for us and now. But if you look at it then in a time perspective, actually this short-term rational behavior, it's totally irrational from a longer term. So all the crises, be it related to climate, be it related to biodiversity, pollution, or if you want social, are basically the long-term result of rational behavior in the short term, which means that the signals are really crucially important, and our focus on changing those signals to all of us market players should absolutely change. This leads me to the importance of natural resource management. And when we talk about today about the major challenges which we have, we talk about climate change, biodiversity loss, we actually talk about the result of the problem, the state, the impact. Immediately when we would start to talk about what is the reason, what are the drivers and pressures, we would come to humans, to the economics. And the importance of natural resources in this respect is that they are kind of bridge between both sides. So how we manage natural resources is actually decisive for our economic results. But how we mismanage them is actually resulting in climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. So why the focus is so important but still lacking? Because it's a common cause of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and health implications, which is at the same time also delivering a clear message of hope that if we identify the root causes of this crisis, we can deliver policy responses that can tackle them effectively together, which is not many times the case. So when we talk about natural resources, what we actually talk about? We talk about biomass, metals, fossil fuels, non-metallic minerals. We are calling them in International Resource Panel materials. So everything extracted from Earth are basically materials. And then on the top of that, of course, you have to add also the water and land management. Some basic data from our not so far published research. The global material use has more than tripled in last 50 years. It has more than doubled per capita, which means that majority of tripling can be devoted to the economic growth and to a lesser extent also to the population growth, which undoubtedly it's also an important factor. What is extremely interesting is that material productivity, that's the non-dotted solid black line in the slide, was actually increasing globally till year 2000 and then started to fall. How that is actually possible if it's practically increasing in all countries in the world? Because we have witnessed a shift of production, structural shift, from the countries which are more resource efficient, like yours, like European Union, like also, for example, Japan, to the countries which are at average per unit of GDP less resource efficient, like China, like India, and I could continue. So we can see that today, if we look through the global lenses, we are actually worse off than we were before the year 2000. We have also looked to the environmental impacts in value chain in only extraction and processing phase. And the research results are that 90% of global biodiversity loss and water stress can actually be connected to extraction and processing, majority to the biomass, which means if you want to deal with those questions, focus on agriculture, forestry, oceans. That 50% of the global climate change can be devoted to that, and even 1/3 of the pollution health impacts. So if I translate the last message to a more understandable, if you buy a car, park it for the whole life, so you actually never drive it, you have already caused 1/3 of the pollution, because the resources for the car needs to be extracted and also car needs to be produced. So if current trends would continue, according to IRP, the global material consumption, it's predicted again to double by 2060, which means that it's inevitable that if we want to continue developing and growing our well-being, economic activity in the future, we need to decouple that from the natural resource use, and both should be decoupled from the environmental impacts. That's why decoupling is so important and crucial. If we look at through the perspective of the Sustainable Development Goals, we actually talk about a kind of dual decoupling. On one hand side, increasing well-being per unit of resource use. So these are the links to some social economic indicators. And then on the second side, decreasing environmental pressures per unit of resource use, which is the link to the environmental SDGs. Circular economy, which many of you know about a lot, should be seen as an instrument for delivering that decoupling. But it should be also seen as a part of a bigger picture of that economic, societal, cultural, if you want, transformation needed to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. But there are some things on which I would like to draw your attention. What it's pretty much essential is that we move from sectors more to thinking about functionalities, about human needs. Actually, we don't need cars, we need mobility, we don't need light bulbs, we need light, we don't need chairs, we need to sit, we don't need refrigerators, we need chilled, healthy food, we don't need CDs, we want to listen to the music, we don't need pesticides, we want healthy plants. So dematerialization, rethinking ownership, moving from only efficiency also to sufficiency concepts is pretty much essential. If I give you just one explanation so that it will be easier to understand why that is so important. If you are a producer selling light bulbs sold to us consumers are basically the basis for the profit. So you are incentivized to use and sell them more. If you are selling the light, it's just the opposite. The number of the light bulbs which you use for selling the light, it's the cost of the producer, which means that incentive in the economic system, it's working just in the opposite direction when it comes to the use of natural resources as it is running today. Or if you want, if we look to the mobility systems, some are believing that replacing all combustion cars with electrified cars, it's the solution. Actually, it's not. It's an important part of the solution, to be honest, but it's not. It's far from all important part of the solution, because the real problem in Europe today is that the typical European car is 92% parked, 1.6% it's looking for parking, 1% is sitting in congestion. We are driving it 5%, and even when we are driving it, it's at average 1.5 person in a 5-seater, which means that the utility of privately owned car is actually around 2%. So you can just imagine how much of the natural resources are actually non-efficiently built in all the cars which are around us. So the real question of mobility is the question which you need to look at in a holistic way. And in that holistic way, you have to predict also the play which the electric car should play. That's why these everything as a service models are extremely critical and important for future economic organization. From sustainable value proposition design to the business model and financial design, which includes business model design and revenue model and financial capital and risk design, to the product and operating model design, from build phase, use phase, and loop phase, to the finally ecosystem design, internal and external. This, I think, it's extremely important part on which I would advise you to focus. Now, let me share with you a bit, because it's quite symptomatic, a bit of the analysis of the recent COP26. Why I do consider that as relatively problematic for the future developments. The focus, it's mainly based on optimizing, on greening the current economic model. I firmly believe that unfortunately this will not be enough to meet the 1.5 degrees target, because deep system change transformation is needed, and it's needed without any delay. Second, it is addressing mainly supply side problems. So it's ignoring the need for a deep system change transformation. So it's not addressing any of the questions which are connected to the overconsumption and who is actually today currently overshooting the planetary boundaries. And this is creating a kind of lasting tensions among high-income, low-income countries in these debates, since the real drivers and pressures are not adequately addressed, and high-income countries are not held actually properly accountable. And it is pretty much still energy climate bubble. So ministers for industry, agriculture, transport, trade, social matters, finance, which have a lot of answers in their hands, do not participate. And the approach is really much energy focused. When natural resource management related matters are discussed, they are not really addressed in the real system change logic and solution. So if I give you just one example of the mobility which I talked before, something which is today known as Glasgow Breakthrough was announced on road transport, aiming for zero emissions vehicles to be the new normal, accessible, affordable and sustainable in all the regions by 2030. I sincerely hope that this will not be a new normal, because this new normal would cause us a lot of the new lock-ins and new problems. So if you look from the energy logic side, which is a very important, the crucial phase, if I can say so, many people are looking only to energy part of the story, not looking behind for what that energy is used. If we look through this slide, fugitive emissions from energy production are less than 6%, but majority is energy use in buildings, in transport, in industry, and one can add also agriculture. According to recent research from Ellen MacArthur, some 45% of all the emissions are coming from the production of cars, clothes, food, and everyday products. And we have in the IRP analyzed a few years ago the impacts of electricity generation technology. So it's essential that you don't look only through the optic of GHG, but also other. So, for example, we took also the impacts on human health, ecosystems health, land use, and material use. While it is clear that renewables are much outperforming anything which is fossil fuel based practically in all areas, when it comes to material use, we can see that the picture is actually different. So there is none of electricity production which would not have environmental impacts. That's why it is essential that in the first place we try to look how much of that we can save, how much of that we can, through the change of consumption production system, actually really make it not needed, and then start cleaning what is left. So it's important to combine supply-side solutions with demand-side solutions and nature-based solutions. Currently, we are focusing only on the orange, and only through that optic, I firmly believe that we can deliver convincing answers to fight against climate change. So when I look to UNFCCS through the approach and leadership, despite sincere efforts by many political leadership, it's obviously still not convincing. Language games remain the way to avoid the real action. There is no real impact difference between saying encourage or strongly encourage, and time spent on wording, it's basically wasted. And phrases such as one which was used in the conclusions, phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, are not only useless, they are dangerous, because in a way we are saying that fossil fuels can be efficient also, and that's quite dangerous kind of optic to look to that problem. Low-income countries remain focused predominantly on financial support because we don't address the real drivers. And I can predict now that in the future FCCs, we will just see increasing amounts coming from low-income countries because they would feel that they cannot master their challenges in different way. But this is not the real way if you do not approach in a more systematic way to solve that issues. So in summary, I think that approach and negotiations are too much based on optimizing already well-established, historically present COP topics, and there is little readiness for reconsidering current state of art, as well as introducing new solutions, and more of the same, even if more frequent, which they have decided, will unfortunately not be enough. European Green Deal, it's a major breakthrough, to be honest. If I compare it to the times when I was in the Commission, this is really kind of historical document, new growth strategy which aims to protect, conserve, enhance natural capital, which is clearly talking about decoupling, which is clearly talking about net zero emissions, so decarbonization. And it's also clearly part or crucial part of European strategy to implement the UN international commitments, including the SDGs. They have later on adopted also Fit for 55, which focus on speed and scale of the vision and targets. But again, here it's the same challenge, which I see that we need a bit more of the system change approach. Focus on low-hanging fruits and easy deliver options, which is by majority the focus of that approach, is actually somehow disregarding that 2030 is just intermediate target to the carbon-free economy in 2050. And if we will not address also more challenging things immediately, there will be no low-hanging fruit anymore after 2030. Actually, there will be no fruits at all. So recently we have adopted Systemic and the Club of Rome together, something which we call the System Change Compass. So we admit that the ambition, vision of the European Green Deal is clear, but that implementation is uncertain because it does not sufficiently address drivers and pressures that cause environmental damage, because it does not offer systemic perspective, and because also implementation is, of course, put at extra risk due to the COVID-19 recovery. That's why we have proposed a system which is a simple on one hand, but trying to connect the policy side with the real economy. So we have identified 10 system change compass principles. This is just to put you in the logic of the thinking. And then we have for each of them identified a policy orientations, so 3 for each of 10 principles, 13 total. And then we have linked that to the economic ecosystem, but to functionalities, to human needs rather than to the sectors. And finally, to the investment opportunities. So we have identified 10 basic redefinitions which would be needed. Redefining prosperity, natural resource use, progress, matrix, competitiveness, incentives, consumption, finance, governance, and finally leadership. Of course, each of these would actually need, so if I would want to explain you the compass logic, I would need the whole presentation for that. So I would just like you to point you and give you a kind of a teaser that you would maybe take that document in your hands and see it more in detail by yourself. So just 2 examples. When we talk about redefining prosperity, there are 3 policy orientations. One is do not focus only on creation of the income, of the wealth, but accompany that also with the focus more on how we actually distribute it. Because economic transition, which we talk about, environmentally based, will fall or fly on social part. So nothing which is good and cannot be socially accepted will, of course, not be accepted at the end. Then we have to create conditions for social acceptance of this necessary transition so that we could be in a position to absorb the full cost introduced through all economic ecosystems. And our advice is also to replace part of the income-based taxes with resource-based taxes to address resource as well as the social policy targets. Or if you look at it through the number 5, redefining competitiveness, we should build European competitiveness, which is more based on resource, including energy, productivity, leading to optimization enabled by digitalization. We should support development and deployment of new digital services based on other resource and energy reducing models. And we should support solutions which will strengthen resilience, strategic autonomy of the European economy, provide new local jobs, and enhance education and job retraining programs. So from there, we have moved to the economic ecosystem, so to the real economy, if you wish. But here again, this is entirely through the natural resource lenses. If we look which are the human needs, which are resource intensive, first, nutrition, healthy food, second, housing, third, mobility, and fourth, daily functional needs. there are basically no other human needs which are very resource intensive. There are many other human needs, of course, but these are the really resource intensive ones. And then if you look to relevant ecosystems which are actually enablers and supporting these human needs, we have, and are resource intensive, we have identified again 4: nature-based solutions, energy, materials, and finally, innovation, which today mainly is present through digitalization. Of course, all of them are very much interconnected. And the last step which we have done is actually for each of those economic ecosystems, we have proposed a number of investment opportunities, so 50 plus nascent industrial investment opportunities all in all, which is a kind of a blueprint for future investments if you want to align your activities with what our redefinitions of the compass are actually sending us. So if I summarize 10 crucial compass redefinitions, 8 economic ecosystems, 50 plus investment opportunities, and all of them of that accompanied by policy orientations, first on the global level, on the level of the government, and second on the level of specific economic ecosystems. What would that mean in policy terms? Redefining consumption from owing to using, redefining production from mass sales to providing efficient functionalities, redefining core economic incentives such as taxation, subsidies, public procurement, integrating well-being as the objective across all policies, measuring sustainability with a life cycle perspective, harmonizing across all policy areas, activating existing financial potential to enable transition, and looking at innovation in categories of these economic ecosystems that provide societal functions, human needs, rather than in categories of production sectors. To conclude, science is convincing and the change is unavoidable. As Johann Wolfgang Goethe nicely said, knowing is not enough, we must apply, and willing is not enough, we must do. We are pretty much still in the knowing and willing phase, and trying and struggle to apply and do it. I do believe that there has never been a better moment for Europe to move from the history of resource-driven imperialism into an era of responsible use of natural resources, mitigating our resource fragility, and also strengthening preparedness and resilience. This would also clearly position European Green Deal, give it a real historic, strategic weight in our efforts to implement global circular economy and also to implement sustainable development goals. So, from the resource management point of view, the 21st century will be more or less marked by 2 trends. One is decarbonization, and the other is dematerialization. And the question which you should ask yourself is, what does that mean for my business, and how should I best prepare and reorganize to meet these trends and expectations? Circular economy, it's not a new concept. It's actually the oldest concept on the earth. Nature is a bioeconomy organized on the principles of the circular economy, so nothing there is without purpose, nothing is lost. So I think it makes sense to embrace it and finally start to behave accordingly. So for the beginning, I think we should simply answer one simple question. Do we agree that humans are part of nature too? And if we will answer that question positively, of course, there will be certain consequences of our behavior. But for those who would be maybe still in doubt, since I'm currently positioned in Belgium, I think the best would be to ask for the advice the most famous Belgian person, that's the Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. When he was once asked why he is speaking about himself always in the third person, he replied something like that. If one is such a genius like me, it is very important to establish a healthy distance to himself. So that's actually our challenge, that we establish a healthy distance to ourselves, that we do understand that our behavior it's not influencing only us, that it's influencing also how the future generations will live, that it's influencing also how other living beings are living on the planet, and that we hold a major responsibility that this will be done in a way that it holds the principle of the long-term sustainability. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Janusz. Whilst listening to you, I wrote down a few questions, but I think you actually answered most of them yourself already. So that's a little bit of a tricky one. I have one question, but I'm worried. I don't know how we're doing for time. We have a couple of minutes. You mentioned on the compass, there's one, you rushed through it, but it was on taxation from...
I lost you. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it was...
I lost you for a moment.
It was a point on the compass on taxation, moving taxation from, for example, labor to resources, or one could move them to environmental impacts. And I think we're approaching that. This route, we'd approach what is called the ecologic true cost principles. Are we on the road there? Well, I mean, you've been involved in this for such a long time. What's your gut feeling?
We are not there, that's clear, but it's different by different countries, because in European Union, as you know, the tax systems are not something where coordination is done on the European Union level. So I think it's a no-brainer that we would need to move in that direction carefully, but it's always difficult, because changing the structure of taxes is not something which the tax authorities likes a lot, because it's actually complicating their lives. But it's about incentives. It's about what is the most limited resource with which we basically have to deal with, and how we actually incentivize that we would behave more rationally. And I think that is a logical move which would need to be think through all the ministries for finance which are dealing with those questions.
Thank you, Janusz. I think some of the other questions I have, I'm a little bit hesitant to ask, because I think William's going to answer them afterwards. So I don't want to destroy his presentation. Sure. Thank you very much, Janusz, for your contribution. And I think it's good. It put us in a good place to which assumptions do we actually need to make when we think about the innovation or the progress we want to make? What's actually the context? What's the world we want to see that in? Because the world in the future is going to look different to what it does today. So let's innovate for the future. Thank you, Janusz. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Ja, da skal jeg ta og introdusere litt om dagens program. Nå vi felles, men etter hvert så vil vi dele rommene i to, og også programmet. Så det vil si det to spor, spor A og spor B. Og de som på livestream, har også da to valg. Det mulig å hoppe mellom sporene, velge de fagsesjonene dere ønsker å følge. Og som Helene sa, så vil også disse livestreamene ligge ute på våre hjemmesider en liten stund, så man kan gå tilbake, se om igjen, velge andre fagsesjoner, dele med kollegaer, og så videre. Og har dere spørsmål eller kommentarer til innlederne, så kan det skrives inn i chatten, som på høyre side av livestreamen. Så vil vi forsøke å besvare de innledene som kommer, men vi har knapt med tid, så vi skal gjøre så godt vi kan. Og apropos tid, så har vi her fremme noen ender, som dere ser. En grønn, en gul og en rød. Og dette da noe vi har plukket opp Marie og jeg fra Eyde-klyngen. Et lite forsøk på å strukturere disse innlederne i forhold til tid. Så du på grønn, så du fortsatt innenfor. Gul, da det 5 minutter igjen. Og rød, da må du avslutte ganske kjapt. Ja, så vi har da disse to sporene. Spor A har vi valgt å fokusere på det som vi har kalt i bedriften. Og her vil vi fokusere da på sikkerhet, vi vil snakke om fremtidens operatør, og også få historien fra Glencore Nikkelverk i forhold til det med å etablere den nye kobberfabrikken. Veldig spennende. Så har vi i spor B, vi følger egentlig opp alle disse utfordringene som keynote speaker Janers tok opp. Hvordan skal vi løse disse utfordringene? Og det tror jeg vi kan diskutere og få mange svar på i spor B. Vi har kalt det rammebetingelser og utvikling. Og her vil vi høre om sirkulær økonomi, hvordan ressursknappheten i verden kan føre til både innovasjon og nye satsninger. Og så vil vi også få enkelte av Eyde-bedriftene til å fortelle om deres FoU-arbeid. Hver fagsesjon på 45 minutter, og så det da 15 minutters pause. Så da det mulighet til å ta en kaffe, snakke med en kollega eller et annet medlem i Eyde-klyngen. Og så har vi også en annen utfordring som vi har gitt enkelte av våre kjernemedlemmer. Vi har sendt en Eyde-pakke for de som har sagt seg villige til å lage lokale hubber, som jeg har kalt det. Der de har samlet kollegaer. De har fått en Eyde-pakke som inneholder Lego og godteri. Og så håper vi at det en motivasjon til å bygge fremtidens fabrikk og fremtidens operatør. Og gjennom dagen så håper jeg vi får noen innslag fra de og ser resultatene av det som bygd. Så vil vi nå ha en pause frem til klokka 1. Og dere slipper ikke unna med Lego-bygging, for det står et bord på utsiden. Og her kan dere da bidra til å bygge fremtidens fabrikk og operatør. Og vi begynner i Eyde-klyngen veldig tidlig med rekruttering. Så da har vi Anne her, som går i 2. klasse, som vil hjelpe til med bygginga. Det blir bra. Og i den pausen som nå, så ønsker vi at alle forlater rommene her, sånn at vi får delt disse inn i de parallelle sporene. Da vil jeg bare avslutte med første lokale hub som vi har fått en liten filmsnutt fra, og det Henning Olsenis. Så...
De var jo det I sted.
Oi!
Det blir kult.
Han står?
Nei, står
Så, ja, men kanskje
vi skal bygge?
Ja. På bak, så...
Nei, vi bygger jo fremtidsfabrikk for å egentlig løsrive oss fra hvor vi I dag, og se hva vi tenker kan være fremtiden da, og se på hvilke utfordringer har vi I dag som vi tenker I fremtiden kanskje blir mindre på grunn av teknologiske fremskritt.
På taket så dyrker vi jordbær fra overskuddsvarme fra kuldeproduksjonen, og jorda den kommer fra slam fra renseanlegget.
Her isdisken som sier fra hvor kaldt om trenger vedlikehold og hvor full isdisken
Ja, du har bygd en kontrollrom med overvåkningskamera som overvåker hele produksjonen. Så har jeg lagt en trøkk som skal kjøre inn varer ut, returnere varer. Så 2 roboter som skal legge på boks og lokk. Det spannlinja, 2 liter boks.
Ja. Vi glemte operatøren som går rundt med en HoloLens. For han har det mobile kontrollrommet med seg.
Milos.
Han forklart.
Hei, så jeg bygget den linjen. Og så da helt automatisk, fordi du kan samle de sammen med de andre som Nikolai allerede bygget. Og så... Oi, unnskyld.
Altså, filmer du?
Du ser jo ikke.
Okay. Det som ekstra kult med den linjen at den modulær, akkurat som IKEA-sofa. Så hvis du skal ha noe annet her, hvis du vil ha en annen maskin som kan lage andre produkter, hvis du trenger en annen maskin da, så går det an å bare koble den fra her, og så kobler du på en ny maskin. Så det akkurat som å kjøpe en IKEA-sofa, så plutselig vil du ha lang og kort og høy og lav. Siden hver ofte kan være både veldig lokalt og være veldig forskjellig I hele Norge, så har vi også en robot som kan gå rundt i det ganske land og finne ut hvordan været blir på lang sikt. Og det hjelper oss til å lage veldig gode prognoser. For da vet vi hvordan været blir, og da kan vi planlegge produksjonen veldig godt.
Jeg gleder meg til å se FoU med Eyde-klyngen.
Fremtidens operatør.
Det den du gleder deg til å se?
Ja.